Right, I'm going to hand over to Martin Gaywood, who's going to tell us all about beavers.
Thank you, Will. My name is Martin Gaywood. I work at Scottish Natural Heritage, and I suppose my job over the last few years has been working on various species projects of one sort or another. Indeed, I suppose my main involvement in Cairngorms, I suppose, to a certain extent, is when I managed the Species Action Framework, which had a large number of species projects going on, many of which based here in the Cairngorms, on pine hoverflies, wildcats, woolly willow, all sorts of things. But more recently, I've been working a lot on various sorts of conservation translocations, and I've been working on beavers, particularly since about 2000, so I've had fairly long involvement with them. Will was hinting earlier on that there may be some sort of update I could give you in terms of an announcement from the Minister, but I'm going to start off with the update, which is that there is no news, there's no decision yet, so the situation is the same, in that we're still waiting to find out what the future of beavers in Scotland are going to be. So basically this talk today is really going to be based around our Beavers in Scotland report, which we submitted to government and the ministers last June, and basically that sort of summarises 20 years of work looking at all the various evidence, information, etc., and we pulled that together to try and provide the minister with the information that she needed. Okay, is this working? No. Is that, if I press that one, is that one too working?
That one is the one that should work.
No.
Go the other way.
Okay.
Each one plug. Shouldn't do. I think it's. Slide should.
Oh yeah, right. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to basically, before we get into the issue of beavers and the various sort of land use conservation issues, I need to quickly give you a synopsis of beaver ecology, and I'm going to try and do that in about 1 minute. And the key thing to remember when it comes to beavers is they live in family groups, usually an adult pair with the sub-adults and kits from the current year, often 5 or 6 animals. They live in a freshwater riparian woodland habitat situation, so where you get slow-moving or standing waters with woody edges. They feed on a wide range of plants, including woody species, of course. And, of course, the thing they're really famous for is the way they modify their environment. So they're known as what we call an ecosystem engineer. And, in fact, there's probably no other species, apart from humans, that, through their engineering activities, can actually modify their environment to the extent that they do. And they build dams and they create beaver ponds, they can create canals and lodges and so on. And those very activities are great in terms of biodiversity, and many conservationists get very excited about the potential benefits they can bring in terms of improving biodiversity. But at the same time, those very same damming activities and so on can also create conflict as well, as some of these headlines suggest here. And indeed, I could have found you many other headlines as well to pick from the newspapers. So going back to my original point, this is the report we submitted last June, I think it was, and you can download it from this web address, which you'll see in most of the slides, and it's around about 200 pages long, mostly not bedtime reading, but it does summarise pretty well anything and everything that we knew about beavers. And the idea was it helps the Minister make a decision about the future of beavers in Scotland. So the current situation is we have 2 populations. We have Knapdale on the west side in Argyll, which is where the Scottish Beaver Trial has been running, or was running, for about 5 years, and has now been wound up, although the beavers are still there. There's probably around about 4 family groups. That was a licensed trial, which SNH were involved in terms of the independent monitoring. Meanwhile, on Tayside, we have another population, probably in the region of, well, as of 2012, around about 33 beaver families. These are the result of illegal releases and or escapes from collections in the Tayside catchment. So a much larger number of animals on Tayside, unlicensed, and like I say, it shouldn't really be there. So what we covered in the report, these are the 4 main sort of chapter headings to sort of think about. First of all, we looked at what their interactions were with the natural environment, we looked at their interactions with the human environment, we looked at the various legal issues, the management of beavers and their impacts, and then we tried to set out some future scenarios of beavers in Scotland to provide some options, in effect, for the Minister. And I'm going to quickly go through these, and I really am going to race through a lot of it, I'm afraid. I'm only going to just touch the surface, where I'm just going to pick out a few particular things along the way which if is of any interest to you, you can always come back to later and look at in more detail. We're going to start off looking at interactions with the natural environment, and we looked at things like, we reviewed beaver ecology in general. We looked at how in the future, if beavers were to remain, how they might spread throughout Scotland, what sort of habitat they might live in, what sort of numbers they might get, and so on. We looked at the issue of beaver genetics, which is quite a complex area. And then, importantly, we looked at the potential interactions that beavers may have with a wide range of habitats and species, especially freshwater and woodland habitats, and also the range of taxonomic species, groups of species of one type or another, and they're sort of listed there. And for each of these habitats and species, what we did is we effectively did a sort of risk assessment where we sort of took the issues, looked at the potential effects and the way that the beavers might affect these various features, and then we looked at the potential positive aspects and the potential negative aspects. So basically that's sort of summarising what I suppose what I was just talking about there. So what we did is for these impacts assessments, I suppose, we used a lot of the international literature to find out what beavers do across Eurasia and North America, but we also wanted to specifically look at the Scottish context, and of course we could draw on our own observations on Knapdale in particular, where most of the ecological work was done, but also from Tayside as well. And then we also tried to make a judgment as to, if beavers were to stay, what sort of future effect beavers might have, and we tried to sort of try to make assessments in that respect. And we did particularly focus on species and habitats of European importance. And as I said, we did these assessments of potential positive and negative effects. So just to give you a few sort of basics, this is basically a map showing where core beaver woodland occurs throughout Scotland. So this is looking at the whole country, the whole mainland anyway. These patches of green are where you've got good, sort of sufficient quality freshwater habitat combined with broadleaf woodland, riparian woodland edge, and these are the sort of areas where we think they could survive, and also where there is enough habitat where you could actually get viable populations surviving in the longer term. We also even try to make a sort of a judgment as to which islands they might get to. We don't actually have any evidence of them occurring on the Scottish Islands, but nevertheless, based on what we know about where they can move through coastal waters elsewhere in the world, we made a judgment as to which ones they could potentially get to. Quite a hard one to work out, especially when we don't really have any information on the impact of currents and so on. But the islands in green, for example, they could potentially move to and then use those as stepping stones to the islands in purple. It's really just to give an indication of, and highlighting the fact they could potentially move to some islands. We also did things looking at how, if a beavers were living in a particular catchment, the extent to which they would actually be confined to that catchment. Could they actually move easily into other catchments? Bearing in mind that when beavers move around, they very much stick to the freshwater habitat, but they will move away from that freshwater now and again for dispersal activities. So what I've got here is basically the Tayside catchment, and the edge of it is highlighted in that dark green. And you can see these little green bits in the middle are where potentially beavers could move around. And if you just highlight it, if you actually focus in on that orange spot there and look a little bit closer, you can look at the border of the edge of the catchment. And in effect, that purple line is the borderline for which the catchment edge through which beavers wouldn't be able to move. But within that, you can see little patches of green, little breaks, and that's where we think that potentially beavers could actually skip from one catchment to the other, based on their sort of dispersal ecology and so on, and the ability to move through certain sorts of habitat types. So in effect, what this demonstrates is that we think that from pretty well most catchments in Scotland, you're very rarely going to get a situation where they're going to be naturally contained. Over time, and maybe over quite a long time, they will eventually move from one catchment to another. And that takes away the whole issue of them actually being able to move along coastlines as well, which they can do to a certain extent. We also looked at the beavers and biodiversity, and we did an international review. This is the biggest review ever done. In fact, it's going to be published in Mammal Review in the not too distant future. But we looked at all sorts of papers from around the world looking at beavers and the impacts on a wide range of taxonomic groups. So basically, in essence, what this tells you here is, here we just sort of take out some total numbers. We found 46 papers, well 73% of papers rather, showing that beavers have a positive impact overall on these taxonomic groups. The figures in brackets, by the way, I think relates to the Eurasian species. So this is North American and Eurasian species, and that's just the Eurasian species. Basically, Eurasian and North American beavers, different species, but their ecology is basically about the same. 17% negative and 10% negative and 17% neutral. So long and short of all that is, actually no, hold on a minute, I'll hold that message. We also looked at our own experiences in Scotland. So this is Knapdale, for example, and they were doing the sort of things you would expect beavers to do. So top left there is a big down on Dewlock. They sort of flooded a large area. You've got as a result, a lot of standing dead wood, which resulted from the flooded, inundated trees that resulted. A lot of new habitat types. A lot of the standing waters was quite quickly colonised by aquatic plants. You can see changes in the associated riparian woodland before and after. A lot more wetness and a lot less trees as the beaver starts to fell some of the woody species. And these are the sort of species you anticipate that you would benefit from the presence of beavers of one sort or another, which occur in Scotland at the moment. Many of these are of European importance, of course. So the long and short of all that is that we're quite clear that beavers have a very positive influence on biodiversity overall. They do this through creating new habitats and habitat diversity at the catchment scale. So that's a sort of big overall message, but I'm going to just highlight some caveats here, which is that not all species are going to benefit, and we need to be aware of that. There are some habitats and species of high conservation importance that have the potential to be adversely affected. Things like Atlantic hazel woodland, aspen woodland, woodland where deer are abundant, where you get the combination of beavers knocking back trees and then deer then browsing the regrowth. And potentially and possibly migratory salmonids, which that's a bit more of an uncertain one. I'll come on to that in a minute. So taking Atlantic hazel woodland, for example, this is a very special sort of woodland we get especially on the west coast. It has really important communities of lichens and bryophytes, really of global importance. It's one of our real special habitat types. And this is what happened at Knapdale. This is some patches of Atlantic hazel around some of the lochs at Knapdale. The shading of green, the darker the green, the more dense the hazel around the lochs. And this shows you the impact of the beavers. The darker the red, the higher the proportion of hazel in those blocks that were taken by beavers. And you can see as you get close to the edge in particular, in some instances, you're getting almost complete take of all the hazel in some patches. So looking at the sort of national, if you then try and look at the national resource of hazel throughout Scotland and then see how potential beaver habitat overlaps with that, we've got, well, where hazel, for example, is more than 25% of the canopy, then potentially there's about 25% of our hazel resource could potentially be within a beaver area, so to speak, and therefore could potentially be affected one way or another. And these are sort of figures we also get for aspen woodland. Beavers love aspen. We don't have very much of it in Scotland, of course. I mean, in terms of area, we've only got 209 hectares or so, whereas more than 25% aspen in the canopy. Not very much at all, and a lot of that does overlap with potential beaver habitat. So the thing to emphasise there basically is that there is, in addition to the beavers having a potential positive impact on biodiversity, there are these particular conservation issues which, if beavers were to be introduced, you'd have to really think carefully about how you manage in terms of ensuring their conservation status is maintained. We also looked at the issue of beavers and their interactions with the human environment. So now coming on to the more sort of socioeconomic type issues. I'm not going to really have time to go into this in any great detail. In fact, I haven't even got a sort of slide here about public and animal health, and I'm quite happy to answer questions about that one later. So we did socioeconomic assessments both at Knapdale and at Tayside. We also did reviews looking at how ecosystem services provided by beavers might be beneficial in various ways. Things like groundwater storage, flow stabilisation, flood prevention. These are all sort of things that are often raised as potential benefits of beavers. And the very fact that there's also the cultural services side of things, the fact that beavers can contribute to human well-being and they have these potential positive socioeconomic impacts. And of course, we're also aware that in terms of the way that beavers are perceived, there have been quite a number of public consultations of one sort or other over the years, and generally speaking, public support has been quite high when it comes to the beavers being present in Scotland, but there are specific sectors, specific land use sectors, who have serious concerns about their presence. So if we actually start looking at some of the issues when it comes to land uses and beavers, we actually got a lot of information from Scotland on Tayside in particular, where the beavers are present in many places, very agricultural areas. And there was something called the Tayside Beaver Study Group set up, which was involving a number of sort of stakeholders in that area, and they actually tried to collate and pull together information on all sorts of beaver impacts on land use. And so this sort of summarises some of the things that they were found to be doing. And again, there's more detail in the various reports I referred to earlier. So beavers can have these sorts of impacts: burrowing, dam building. They can forage on crops, especially close to the water edge, and they can fell trees, of course. And we've got quite a range of examples recorded from Tayside, and the extent and significance of these impacts will depend basically on a range of things, especially the local habitat, the topography, the soil structure, and so on. Here's an example of some poplars felled by a trunk road, and fortunately the trees went in the right direction. But so it shows you sort of issues you've got to think about in terms of safety as much as anything else. So then there's issues such as their burrowing activities, and there's been particular issues in the lower catchment on Tayside, where there's some high productivity, high value agricultural land, where beavers have been particularly active and where there's been most conflict. So this example is quite an extreme one, I suppose. It's where there are flood defence banks, and what's happened here is the beavers have actually burrowed into the flood defence bank, nice soft ground, they've burrowed in, and then ultimately the bank has collapsed, and that had to be repaired, and that one instance cost about £5,000 to repair, so a large amount of money. And there were lots of other sort of situations where there have also been, not so maybe so as dramatic as that, where you get damming in drainage systems and you get localised flooding, etc. Then there's time and money in terms of not just the impact maybe in those agricultural zones which are being flooded, but also obviously the time required to go in, remove dams and so on, and to monitor them as well. So they can have these negative impacts, but also at the same time we've got to remember they can also have potential positive land use impacts as well, the way they can contribute to sort of wider land use objectives that many of us are trying to get to, in terms of creating an adaptable environment. And I'm thinking here about the hydrological benefits I referred to earlier, health and well-being and so on, the way that public are interested in them, health, the educational side, the interpretation, getting out in the countryside, that sort of thing. There's the fishery issue, and that's quite a big issue, and that Atlantic salmon, of course, high value rural industry, salmon under a range of pressures as it is already. The issue was, are beavers, or the presence of beaver dams in particular, going to impact the movement of migratory salmonids, salmon, sea trout or whatever, in moving along river stems, etc. And I think the long and short of it all is, we actually had something called the Beaver Salmonic Working Group looking at this, which includes fisheries scientists, agencies and so on. And I think the jury is still out to a certain extent. I think it seems clear that the beavers can potentially have a range of benefits. Those dams might, for example, result in beaver pools. Those beaver pools can provide nursery areas for young fish. Maybe at sort of large catchment scales, those fish populations can benefit from that. But in certain situations, at certain times of year, when water levels are low, those same dams might actually present barriers to fish movement, and they might present situations where fish are unable to go upstream in certain areas and spawn. But it is an area where I think more research is needed, and indeed we are funding a PhD at the moment looking at this very topic of beavers and beaver dams and fish movement. Got a couple of minutes, is that still okay? Yeah, okay, I think we might just make it. So we also looked at legal issues and management. We reviewed management techniques from Europe and North America. The good thing about being last, I suppose, is that everybody else is testing out these management techniques first. So there's things which are to do with managing the beaver impacts, and then there's methods for dealing with managing the beavers themselves. And we've sort of, there's a range of different techniques. I won't go into the detail, but these were all reviewed, and we also reviewed them in a Scottish context. You know, would they be legal? What are the implications? What are the costs, etc., etc.? And again, that's presented in the report. And also the animal welfare implications, of course, which are particularly important, especially to the public and the public view as to how we manage wildlife. So that's where we are, and what happens next. So I was wondering when I was asked to give this talk whether today I'd actually be able to say something in terms of whether a decision had been made, but we're not there yet. So the Minister's still considering the report, and so at some point the decision is going to be made on where next with beavers. For the meantime, we have actually published some interim management guidance that's available on the website. So that, for example, where there is a land use issue, farmers have or land managers have a number to call. We can send out a contractor to provide advice. We provide some advice on the sort of management techniques, what's legal, what's not legal, etc. The report that we presented to the Minister set out 4 broad future scenarios, everything ranging from remove all the beavers to allow a full national scale reintroduction of the beasts, and looking at the pros and cons of each. And the risk and benefits of all those options are set out to help over decision making. If beavers do stay one way or another, then a key thing will be to develop a responsive management strategy for beavers, and that would need to be done in collaboration of a wide range of stakeholders. It'd be pretty fundamental, this, and it's something that stakeholders have mentioned time and time again that they would expect this to happen. And such a management strategy would need to set out the sort of management options available, provide the relevant guidance, identify sources of support and advice and so on. If there were to be any future translocations, that we would expect them to follow the Scottish Code for Conservation Translocations, which is the way we now advise that translocations are done in Scotland. That was produced for a range of, with the help of a range of stakeholders, something called the National Species Reintroduction Forum. They obviously need to develop the relevant research and monitoring programme to go into more detail some of the issues I mentioned before, where we're still not quite there yet with some of the information we need. And there's also the need to try and identify opportunities where beaver reintroduction and management could be set within wider aims of long-term land use planning. And there we are. Thanks very much.